I'm Scott Tibbles with the Investing News Network, and today I'm having another chat with Remi Piet, who is Senior Director at America's Market Intelligence. Thank you for joining me, Remi.
My pleasure to be there, otherwise.
So, the last time I spoke with Remi, we spoke about Guyana, which Remi described as having the potential to become the next Qatar in the energy world, with plans by major oil and gas producer ExxonMobil to produce up to 120,000 barrels of oil a day in the country in the near term. I recommend listeners have a listen to that interview, which was published on the INN website on August 27 under Oil and Gas. So, Remi, can you tell me a little more about the situation between Guyana and its well-known neighbor, Venezuela? Listeners will, of course, know that Venezuela is a member of OPEC with a history of high oil production. That's all been under a shadow since the presidency of Hugo Chavez, and possibly even more so since Nicolas Maduro took over. Maduro, of course, has a contested administration. What can you tell me about the situation between the two countries, Remi? One with a history of oil production and an ongoing fraught situation, and one with oil in its future right next door.
Well, there's plenty of things that could be said, and obviously you have to look at the relation between Venezuela and Guyana and the impact that it has in terms of reserves and potential for exploration and extraction of those reserves under a series of different dimensions, whether from the legal, institutional perspective, or security perspective, or geopolitical angle also. First of all, in terms of the capacity from Guyana to become a very large player in the energy field. I mean, obviously you mentioned the perspective of production from ExxonMobil on a daily basis. ExxonMobil actually thinks that its discovery could actually hold as much as 700 million barrels of crude off the shore of Guyana. So we're looking at a very strong, high level of reserves. There's also some reserves that actually are being investigated off the shores of Suriname to a lesser extent. But we're looking at as a very game changer for this Caribbean country. And the fact that it still has, especially in the region where those reserves have been found, which is off of the Essequibo region, a region that is bordering Venezuela with a land dispute between the Maduro regime and the Granger administration today in Guyana. That land dispute that dates back from the 19th century. Obviously, you need to be very clear as to what are what is the situation, what are the claims of both countries, and what is the security for any kind of investor that wants to operate in those regions, of whether or not this is going to become a zone of conflict, or if it is something that they actually can expect to be operating for several decades, for especially in light of the very strong level of reserves out of the shore of Guyana. So if you want me to go a little deeper in terms of the conflict that you have in that specific region, it's nothing new between Venezuela and Guyana. It has gained some traction for two reasons over the last 2 years. First of all, obviously because of those discoveries from ExxonMobil, and also because of a change of strategy from the Guyana presidency under Granger, that has decided to take a different strategy in terms of trying to get a clear settlement on that specific question of frontier between Guyana and Venezuela. You're looking at a region which is characterized by very dense forest. It's not very highly populated. The dispute that you have between Venezuela and Guyana dates back from the time of colonization, when Guyana was actually British Guyana under British rule. Venezuela was still a Spanish territory. And so the actual distinction between the two countries has never been very clear, especially in around 1830s, 1840s. The British empires tried to actually use a series of scientific research and naturalists and explorers to actually define what should be the frontier. It had led to a series of disputes, and the big dates to remember on this one is in 1899, yes, when you had an arbitration between both Venezuela and British Guyana at the time under British rule, of what should be the frontier between the two territories. And that's the frontier as we know today, which is basically had given sovereignty to Guyana over 90% of the disputed territory, especially the Essequibo River, which is where you have now the oil reserves, and having Venezuela just having sovereignty over the Orinoco Delta, which is was a smaller a smaller river, and especially when you actually look in details into the delimitations of the two countries, you even see that at the level of the Orinoco Delta, you still have the border that actually follows the shoreline that allows Guyana to have a larger extent of maritime territory where you have right now the offshore
Hmm.
discovery. So this happened in 1899. Now the key problem that you have there is that later one of the arbitrator of this international arbitration called Mallet Prévost actually released part of his personal library was found a memo that there was a series of allegations of bribes of pressure from the president of the tribunal that was Russian. It's nothing to do with today's Russia because it's before even the Communist Revolution 1905. We're talking about 1899, and these actually showed that this arbitration was void because it was the result of a series of malpractices and did not follow the let's say a transparent um, debate and based on any kind of scientific and respiratory work done before. And so that has put the situation in 1949 started having a series of discussion until the early 1960s. In 1966, you had an agreement in Geneva between both Venezuela and then British Guyana, turning to becoming Guyana at the time because we were talking about the eve of Guyana's independence. That agreed that this a ruling in 1899 was stained with a series of wrongdoings, and therefore there should be some kind of a, let's say, a new agreement and going through the United Nations good offices practices that will arrive to some kind of a settlement between both Venezuela and Guyana. Now,
Oh,
this has unfortunately never led to any kind of successful settlement or agreement. In 1982, so we're talking about 30 years ago, 40 years ago almost now, Venezuela decided to decline to renew this moratorium agreed in Port of Spain, 1966, about trying to find good and diplomatic settlements. And we've been in a situation where there hasn't been clear decision of who those maritime territory and even all the Essequibo region, who does it belong to? De facto, it is today part of the Guyanese territory, based on this 1899 decision arbitration that has been suspended by both parties in 1966, and up to today. We have obviously Guyana exerting sovereignty, having some kind of historical claim on it, but Venezuela refusing to actually agree that this territory is not part of today's Venezuela. Um, the change that we have over the last couple of years is that Guyana decided to move away from the United Nations Good Offices process because it simply did not show any kind of results since it was first created in 1970 and then declined and repelled by Venezuela in 1982. So what they decided to do is to turn towards the ICJ, the International Court of Justice in The Hague, to take a decision over this sovereignty, the sovereignty of the region, and we're expecting any kind of a ruling in the coming years of clearly what is the position of the international community on the territory. Venezuela declined to be part of this process, and we're talking about a Venezuela today, which is much different from Venezuela in the 1980s or in the 19th century that was first part of this conflict over land. We're looking at both the Chavez and then Maduro administration, and their claim is that, to their perspective, the ICJ or the entire United Nations body is actually biased towards the Guyanese/American claim, American-backed claim over the Essequibo rivers, and therefore it's not a process that they will agree to or abide to today. So that's the legal perspective to this conflict.
okay. And so, what can you tell me about the region physically? So it's not a small strip of land. It's quite a large area. So it's 159,000 square kilometers. It's more than half of Guyana's territory. And from what I understand, the geography is so dense, so the forest is so dense that there aren't actually any border crossings between Guyana and Venezuela. So this is quite frontier territory, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're looking at, Guyana is already a tiny country, but at this area, you have very limited, let's say, urban centers. You have a few settlements like Kumaka, Chariti, all those Ana Regina, also just on the border of the Essequibo River. But this is mainly 95% forest. You also have on the Venezuelan side, you actually have the Sierra de Mataca, which is delimiting one way or another a little bit the frontier between, in terms of geography, between the two territories. But obviously, you don't have any roads, so you don't have any kind of police of policing at the frontier. It's an area that has not been on the forefront of headlines over the last few decades because, in spite of this disagreement in terms of territory between Venezuela and Guyana, it was not in the forefront of interest until the discovery of oil reserves in the country at the let's say offshore of this region, and therefore the claim that those reserves did belong whether to Venezuela or to Guyana. In the situation that we are here today, obviously those ExxonMobil is the one company carrying the exploration processes on this Essequibo region in offshore. You had a series of small disputes and conflict with claims in March, if I'm not wrong, March 2018, sorry, that two boats from ExxonMobil were actually threatened by the Venezuelan army while carrying some exploration work, and a series of diplomatic cables, both from Venezuela and Guyana, saying, well, you're infringing on my sovereignty by being present on whether the Venezuelan or Guyanese territory. And so this is a situation right now of a cold conflict that becomes much more interesting when you take it from the energy perspective or from the current geopolitics conflicts over Venezuela and the Maduro administration today.
And speaking of the political situation, is the concern in the rest of the world that the development in Guyana could sort of come under the control of Venezuela? I mean, Venezuela is currently embargoed by the United States. It's in the bad books of a lot of Western countries. Is that what's motivating a lot of the interest in the area?
Well, a lot of the interest is motivated by the staggering amount of oil reserves that you have offshore, obviously.
Mm.
Now, the issue of whether or not there's a risk today that Venezuela will take over the entire, concessions operated right now by a series of Western oil companies, mainly. You also have, some consortium between Canadian and Chinese companies operating in the region, but the main actor is ExxonMobil. You have Repsol, you have, Total also is there. Whether or not, the question of whether or not, Venezuela will suddenly decide to try to take over with a military operation over those reserves, that's something that is not in the mind of anyone today over the next coming month, because simply the Trump administration will be more than happy to use this as a pretext to engage in terms of military operations against Venezuela. If we're looking at a ramping up of the conflict, and when you take it from the perspective of whether or not the Maduro administration will be sustained in a current state of American foreign policy towards the country. So Maduro is well aware that that will be a move that will lead to very strong retaliation from the U.S. and from any kind of Western power. So that's probably not going to happen, anytime soon. But obviously, there is still this claim over a territory and who has the right to issue concessions. The ICJ is right now the ultimate body that would actually, probably will legitimate the capacity of the Guyanese government to have, awarding those concessions to different companies. But there's obviously a legal risk there, whether it's something that should be, in a clear on the front page of any worries from companies operating in Guyana. Probably not, but that should be something that they have to keep tab on. The issue that probably is much more important for investors in this specific region are probably issues of reputational risk or security risks, as you were mentioning. The frontier between Venezuela and Guyana is a frontier that is not policed today. It's a frontier where you have a series of operations from illegal miners, specifically because of the existing gold reserves very close to the surface, where you have a series of informal and illegal miners that operate there with impact in terms of impact on the environment, on the Amazonian forest. You also have a series of criminal groups operating and drug trafficking routes on this specific frontier. So in terms of operational, capacities offshore of Guyana and the possibility that Venezuela will intervene and try to gain sovereignty on this, that's not something that will happen anytime soon. But companies should be very much aware of this existing conflict, but even more at the let's say subnational level of existing impact on the environment, or drug trafficking and security, the impact it could have on the reputation of companies operating in Guyana or at the frontier between Guyana and Venezuela, without taking some clear steps of due diligence, understanding the situation, and clear the name in case there's any kind of reporting on that.
Okay, so it would be fair to say that investors should be more interested in what's going on internally with Guyanese politics. I mean, last time we spoke, you talked about the interesting situation between the political parties there and what was going on with voting and the leadership.
Yeah, we're trying to be a little succinct on this because we actually already addressed that in last interviews. You have a very specific situation right now in Guyana, in the sense that Guyana is a country that is characterized by two communities, one Indo-Caribbean, one Afro-Caribbean, that make up more or less 45% of the population each. The Afro-Caribbean are in power since President Granger won the election a couple of years ago, but his majority, his coalition, had just had a majority of one seat until last December. Last December, one congressman decided to shift allegiance to the other party, and therefore not vote in favor of the Granger administration. That should have triggered some immediate elections within the next 3 months. That brings until last March. It hasn't happened because the Granger administration made the point that the switch of allegiance was linked to a series of corruption practices, with especially that specific congressman having received close to $1 million in solid gold to be able to actually change his allegiance and vote for the other party. So we're in a situation right now in terms of politics where you have, from a perspective of the opposition, an illegitimate majority and presidency that has to call elections over the next few months. Those elections are likely to happen before the end of the year, because you can't stall until 1 or 2 more years on this situation, and you will see probably fiercely fought battle between the Indo-Caribbean PPP and the APNU AFC coalition of David Granger, trying to retain his position to rule the country for the next few years, and therefore having obviously access to the subsidies of the oil production that should happen in the next 1 or 2 years.
Okay, and of course, listeners can hear more about that in the previously mentioned interview that was published on the Investing News website on August 27. So,
yeah, strongly encourage any company that wants to operate in Guyana, whether in terms of mining or energy companies, or even infrastructure for that matter, to reach out to us, because there's a real need to understand both, let's say, the security situation at the frontier between Venezuela and Guyana, but more importantly, both national and the regional politics here of what will be the people in charge of setting up new regulations and probably profiting some companies over some others in some public procurement policies. Especially, you also need to be very careful in vetting your local partners and making sure to carry out the right due diligence for the limited amount of local companies, but that are often linked to one party or the other, and the capacity to choose your right management team in a country where those capacities are fairly limited. So we are happy to engage in any kind of conversation.
of course, and so that's with America's market intelligence. And so, speaking of regional security, let's take a trip east. So let's look at French Guiana. We have spoken about this before, but let's just touch on it again. So there has been some evolution in the Macron administration in its approach to mining. So of course, listeners will know that French Guiana is part of France and therefore part of the European Union. So what can you tell me about where the French administration stands on mining in French Guiana, and what does that say about the future of mining in that territory?
Well, I mean, you have here a situation in French Guiana, which is, I mean, in terms of geology, in terms of geography, is fairly similar to Suriname and Guyana, meaning that it's a jurisdiction was fairly hard to operate because of the lack of infrastructure, but that has very strong capacity in terms of reserves, especially in gold mining in the Guyana Shield. The very similar reserves that you would find in Western Africa today are coming from the same geological predisposition as the Guyana Shield. So you do have very strong, high level of gold reserves in both Suriname, Guyana, and French Guyana. Now, In case of administrative rules, French Guyana is a European territory with very strong regulations, where most of the politics is actually decided not in Guyana, but much more in Paris. And in that case, France does not have a very strong history of mining. There's very limited mining projects in the mainland of France. There's actually very strong, however, potential in both Guyana and also New Caledonia, that's in the Pacific, where you have strong reserves in nickel. But those policies in terms of what mining code should be implemented in France and therefore in the French territory of French Guyana and New Caledonia are things that are decided in Paris with a series of political game, the importance of the, let's say, green, anti-climate change, pro-environmentalist policies put in place by Macron that needs to have strong allies from the Green Party. And as a result, the support from Macron to one of the key projects in French Guyana that was called Montagne d'Or has steadily slipped and been reduced over the last few years up to this summer, where Macron's administration, especially the Ministry of Energy, let's say ecological transition, which is number 3 in government in France, called François de Rugy, had taken a strong position against the Montagne d'Or project. Now, since then, we've seen a series of development. François de Rugy had to resign over the summer because of claims that he misused some public funds. You have a totally different new team, new minister, especially in that ministry. The Born was much more technical and much less anti-industry and ideological than the regime was. And there are obviously, this question has been on the forefront of politics in France in terms of what would be the policy towards Guyana. And there's probably will have more time to develop this in a future interview. But right now, there are two claims that are very, antagonistic from one another. The mining industry believes that it's not possible now to have sound projects in French Guyana because you will not have the support from both Paris or the local population. And it's actually fairly mistaken. And you also have the position from NGOs that believe that despite this position from the Macron administration, you still have 360,000 hectares of territory that are open for exploration and the production of gold mining. So here, both claims are actually fairly biased. It's very interesting to know that you actually can continue carrying on some sound projects, very well structured in French Guyana. There's a few projects that are very interesting to look at, but you have to abide to a series of very strict European regulations and know how to operate with local political and also economic actors while making your case in Paris with now a new administration, a new team of engineers and political actors. And on the other side, understand that those claims from anti-mining groups in French Guyana have been motivated especially by the European elections that passed just before the summer, and it's you still have, despite this, to operate with clearly with the social actors, the indigenous communities in French Guyana. There's a strong job that needs to be made and made right. The reason why Montagne d'Or was not successful in being developed is because the team in place actually did not carry out the sound social license to operate protocol and being able to socialize the project with the communities ahead of time. So that's something that needs to be very clear in the head of investors or mining companies in French Guyana, that there are ways to do it, but you have to do it right and know how to operate in those territories.
Certainly. Well, that's a very interesting chat about French Guyana for a future interview. But for now, I think that we will leave it there. So again, I'm Scott Tibbles with the Investing News Network, and I've been speaking with Remi Piet of America's Market Intelligence. Thank you for taking the time to have a chat, Remi.
Thank you, Scott.
And that was Remi Piet, Senior Director at America's Market Intelligence. I'm Scott Tibbles with the Investing News Network. You can find us at investingnews.com and feel free to follow us at Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Thanks for listening.